Yes, Israeli fears about a nuclear-armed Iran are overblown. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and his supporters have put forward this notion that the Islamic Republic of Iran seeks to, in effect, become history's first suicide nation, that it's going to take nuclear weapons it does not have and use them to attack Israel and annihilate its Jewish population. The problem with this, in particular, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, is that his national security establishment, including his defense minister, have nearly all come out publicly on the record to say that his idea that Iran would become, in effect, history's first suicide nation and attack Israel with weapons, nuclear weapons it doesn't have, is not real, that what Prime Minister Netanyahu is putting forward is not reality. These national security officials, including the defense minister, Israeli generals, senior Israeli intelligence officials, have all said this publicly. And they've added that even if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, which Flint and I do not believe they're trying to do, but even if they did, these senior Israeli national security officials have come out publicly and regularly to say that it is their assessment that Iran would not use such weapons to attack Israel. So why does Prime Minister Netanyahu and his supporters, why do they continue to hype an Iranian threat? I think many Americans would be surprised to learn that in the wake of the revolution in Iran in 1979 that brought about the Islamic Republic, in the 1980s, when revolutionary fervor was at its height, anti-Israeli rhetoric was at its height, anti-American rhetoric was at its height, Israel refused to cooperate with the United States to impose sanctions on Iran, to undermine it and isolate it. Even after the hostage crisis, Israel refused to cooperate with the United States to do so. Even after the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon that took 241 lives that U.S. officials tied to the Islamic Republic of Iran, Israel still refused to apply sanctions. Even when the United States decided to side with Saddam Hussein in Iraq's war of aggression against Iran, Israel not only refused to cooperate, but they tried to find whatever ways they could to help the Islamic Republic of Iran. When I first went to work for the State Department in May of 1990, the Israelis were still refusing to cooperate with American efforts to sanction, isolate, and undermine the Islamic Republic. That was in May of 1990. By 1991, though, it had completely changed overnight. The reason was the defeat of the Iraqi military with the first Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because with that, Israeli decision makers, both political decision makers and security officials, assessed that they no longer faced the threat from Iraq. They then identified for the first time in 1991, for the first time, identified the Islamic Republic of Iran as the leading security threat to Israel. And since 91, Israeli officials have come from both Labor and Likud governments, have regularly come to Washington to push the proposition that Iran is 6 months to 3 years away from having nuclear weapons. They have done this every year since 1991, and every single time for over 20 years, they have been wrong. But to assuage these baseless fears, what U.S. officials have done in response is they have increased their military cooperation with Israel just to assuage these baseless fears. But these assessments have been, the facts are, wrong. Every year for 20 years, the Israeli assessment that Iran will have nuclear weapons in 6 months to 3 years has been wrong.
I think to understand what's really going on here, it's important to understand Israel's long-standing national security strategy. For decades, Israeli strategy has emphasized using military force first, unilaterally and disproportionately, not just to preempt perceived threats, but to prevent the emergence of independent power centers in the Middle East and preserve Israel's regional dominance. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States, U.S. strategy has also, mistakenly in our view, focused on maintaining this kind of military dominance in the region. This is why the United States and Israel have grown closer together since the end of the Cold War. It's not some illusion of shared democratic values. For if anything, Israel's become less democratic over the last 20 years. From an Israeli perspective, Iran is the one Middle Eastern country potentially capable of imposing meaningful constraints on Israel's freedom of unilateral military initiative. That's what Barak himself has publicly identified as, from an Israeli perspective, so disturbing about an Iran with some level of indigenous nuclear capability. that the next time Israeli leaders think they need to attack Gaza or invade southern Lebanon, they might have to think twice about it. Now, Barak says this wouldn't necessarily mean Israel wouldn't do it, but the decision-making would become more complicated. There's also this myth that President Ahmadinejad or other Iranian leaders have threatened to destroy Israel. This is simply not true, as even Netanyahu's deputy prime minister publicly acknowledged last year. The Islamic Republic considers Israel an apartheid-like and therefore illegitimate state. Iranian policymakers don't believe that a state like that can survive indefinitely in the 21st century. But they hold that Israel's current political system is going to collapse because of its own internal contradictions, like the Soviet Union did, like apartheid South Africa did, not as a result of external aggression by the Islamic Republic. And while a scenario like that is no doubt disturbing to Israelis or supporters of Israel, it doesn't entail an Iranian threat to destroy the Jewish state or Israel's Jewish inhabitants.